this clip, we will demo one entire game turn. This will make for a fairly long clip, but it also gives us a chance to show you how all of the pieces fit together. We are looking at the game map for the introductory scenario, Thermopylae. Game turn 2 has just ended. We are about to enter game turn 3. So the Warsaw Pact player goes to his game turn track and he advances the game turn marker from game turn 2 to game turn 3. The first thing that happens is that each player must now place his reinforcements. However, neither player has any reinforcements on game turn 3, so play proceeds to the Warsaw Pact planning phase. The Warsaw Pact player notes that he has one off-map command point, and that on the map he has got a command point in his forward headquarters here, and he also has another command point in his main headquarters for a grand total of 3 command points. In play, he has the East German 4th Tank Regiment here, and he also has the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th East German Motor Rifle Regiments. So he's got 3 command points and 4 regiments. That means that one of these regiments is going to have to get a march operation, and that will be the East German 4th Tank Regiment because it is not close enough to the front to attack any NATO units. Accordingly, the Warsaw Pact player consults his planning card, and so he will assign a march operation to the East German 4th Tank Regiment, and then he chooses to assign a hasty attack operation to each of his remaining regiments. This requires him to go back to his tracks card and make sure that he's expended that off-map command point, and now his planning is completed. The next thing that happens is that the Warsaw Pact player must roll for the initiative. He rolls the die and he gets a 4. That gives the initiative to the NATO player. The NATO player determines that it is probably in his best interest to pass and force the Warsaw Pact player to go first. The Warsaw Pact player realizes that if he passes, then 2 passes have occurred back-to-back, ending the turn, and since he is the player who needs to exit the map edge, he is forced to take the initiative. So he declares that he is activating the 1 division he has in play, the 4th East German Motor Rifle Division. The Warsaw Pact player now begins his activation cycle, and the first thing that he must do is place a lead unit marker on the lead unit for each of his regiments. Note that a lead unit marker can be placed on a dummy unit, but it must be placed on a unit that is in range of a superior headquarters. There are 2 exceptions. The first is that a lead unit marker can be placed on any unit in a regiment if an off-map command point was used to plan this operation, because off-map command points have unlimited range. The second exception is that a lead unit marker can be placed on any unit in a regiment if the regiment is conducting a march operation, because it never required a command point in the first place. He proceeds to the redeployment segment, but since he's not playing in hidden mode, that is not played, which means that he now goes to the reconnaissance segment. He has got 2 reconnaissance points in his forward headquarters here. He has got 1 reconnaissance point in his main headquarters here. He has no off-map reconnaissance points, so he has a grand total of 3 reconnaissance points, meaning he can make a reconnaissance attempt against 3 separate hexes. He decides that his first attempt will be against this hex here. So he determines that he's got a lead unit at a range of 2 hexes. He refers to the reconnaissance table, and at a range of 2 to 3 in heavy woods, he sees that the acquisition value is a 5, so he needs to roll a 5 or higher. He rolls a 7, and that is enough to enable him to see the hex. However, the NATO player then reveals that the unit is a dummy. And so it goes poof. For his next reconnaissance attempt, the Warsaw Pact player attempts to see this tank unit here. He's actually trying to acquire the hex. He's at a range of 1, 2, 3, 4 against a target in light woods. Once again, he refers to the Reconnaissance table, and he sees that a target at 4 to 5 hex range in light woods has an acquisition value of 5. So he rolls, and he gets a 4. So he has just missed this target. For his final reconnaissance attempt, he chooses to attempt to see this hex here. He is looking at a range of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 against a target in light woods. So he needs a 5 to see this target. He rolls the die. He rolls a 9, and that means that he has successfully acquired this target. Unfortunately, it turns out that it's another dummy, and so it too goes poof. That's the end of his reconnaissance segment. Play now proceeds to his strike segment. However, he is not adjacent to any enemy unit, so he can't observe for a strike, and nor has he acquired any units that he is not adjacent to. Therefore, he has no targets for strikes. This means that his play proceeds to his operations segment. For his first operation, the Warsaw Pact player declares that he will execute the planned hasty attack operation for the 24th Motor Rifle Regiment, and that the objective hex is going to be this NATO occupied hex here. So he has got a dummy here and a dummy here. So the only real unit that he has is this 9-step unit. So he moves this unit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and into this hex. He declines to jam the target because he knows that the NATO player is in a town and also dug in, and therefore the probability of successful jamming is not very high. So the NATO player gets first reaction, but the NATO player declines to react anybody into the hex, and then he gets defensive fire. The NATO player makes a fire call to his artillery unit here, and so he is firing with 12 for his Bradleys, 13 if you include the engineer. The units are doubled because they are infantry and engineers in close terrain and in the objective hex. So the 13 becomes a 26. If you add in the 12 from the artillery unit, the 26 becomes 38. After the standard division by 2, that's 19. The NATO player rolls a 2, so he has inflicted a total of 17 hits. The Warsaw Pact player's adjusted defense strength is 3 + 1 for the heavy woods, so each step will absorb 4. Given that the total hits inflicted is 17, this is sufficient to wipe out 4 of the Warsaw Pact player's steps, leaving 5 to continue the attack. It now becomes the Warsaw Pact player's turn for offensive fire. He has got 15 for his surviving BTRs. He chooses to throw on his DAG up here, and so that adds a further 15, so he's coming in with a grand total of 15. He rolls the die. He rolls a 7, which adds 1 to his hit total, so he's actually inflicted 16 hits. The NATO player has a defense strength of raw 3, plus 4 for the town hex, which takes him to 7, plus 2 for the improved position, which takes him to 9. The Warsaw Pact player has inflicted 16 hits. The NATO player absorbs 9 hits by losing a step, and the remaining 7 hits are not sufficient to do any more damage. The Warsaw Pact player declares that he is going to execute a counter-battery fire attempt against this unit if he's in range. And he is just in range. So the Warsaw Pact player refers to the counter-battery fire table, where he sees that at a range of 4 to 6 against a self-propelled artillery unit, he needs to roll an 8 or higher. He rolls the die, and he rolls a 4, so that counter-battery attempt fails. Proceeding to his next operation, the Warsaw Pact player declares that he is going to conduct the planned hasty attack operation for the 23rd East German Motor Rifle Regiment, and that the target is going to be the very same hex. The Warsaw Pact player has a dummy here, and he has 9 steps here and a dummy here. So he moves his dummies down to here, and he moves his real unit 1, 2, 3 down to here. Again, he declines to jam. Again, the NATO player declines to react. The NATO player goes to defensive fire. This time, the NATO player has got a grand total of 9. That's doubled for being in close terrain in the objective hex, but then half for the standard division by 2, so it's just a straight up 9. The NATO player has no artillery that can fire because his rocket artillery here can only participate in strikes and counter-battery fire strikes, and so as a result, the NATO player fires with straight up 9, rolls the die, he's rolled an 8, that 9 goes to 10. The defense that the Warsaw Pact player has is 3 plus 1 for being in any kind of covered terrain. I should say any kind of non-clear or polder terrain. So with a defense of 4 and 10 hits coming in, the Warsaw Pact player must lose 2 steps from his strongest unit. That absorbs 8 of the 9 hits. The last hit is not enough to claim another step out of that strongest unit. So his 9 goes down to 7. He is now going to fire back. So he's got 21 in his BTR unit, up to 22, including the engineer. Standard division by 2, 22 becomes 11. The roll is a 3, so his 11 becomes a 10. The NATO player has a defense strength of 9, as we determined earlier, so once again, he must lose 1 step, and he can ignore the remaining hits as insufficient to claim another step from his strongest unit. For his next operation, the Warsaw Pact player declares that he is executing the hasty attack planned for the 22nd, and that his objective hex will be this town here. Once again, he's got 2 dummy units and 1 real unit, and so he maneuvers his dummy units 1, 2, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, and then he moves his real forces 1 and 2. The NATO player reveals that he's got 4 steps in that hex. The Warsaw Pact player declines to jam because the NATO player has used up all of his artillery. The NATO player declines to react because he's got no units that could possibly react. They're not within 3 hexes. And so that leaves us with the defensive fire of this Bradley unit. So it's got 4 steps times a natural attack value of 4, or 16. It is doubled for defending in a close terrain objective hex and halved by the standard division by 2, so it's a straight up 16. The NATO player rolls a 2, so his 16 becomes 14. So that inflicts a grand total of 14 hits. The Warsaw Pact player's defense strength is 3 plus 1 for being in any kind of cover. So he's 4. So the 14 hits are enough to claim 3 steps, and the remaining 2 hits are ignored as insufficient to claim another step. So the Warsaw Pact player fires back. He's got a native 24. He's got no more artillery left, so it's just a straight up 24. Standard division by 2 drops that to 12. He fires with 12. He rolls, and he rolls a 4. That means that his 12 is going to become 11. The U.S. unit here has a local defense strength of 3 plus 4 for the town, or a total of 7. So he absorbs 7 hits by losing a step. The NATO player declines to absorb them by retreating, which would put him out in the open. And the remaining 4 hits can be ignored as insufficient to claim another step. And that completes that operation. All of these units should be flipped to their used side. And then the Warsaw Pact player declares that he is going to move his 4th Tank Regiment. We zoom out a bit. So the Warsaw Pact player goes 1, 1.5, 2.5, 3, 4, 5, and he stops there in the cover. And then he moves the remainder of his regiment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then this unit here will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's his last regiment moved. Now he chooses to move his division base, although he could have moved this as the very first formation that he activated had he chosen to. The Warsaw Pact player determines that it's just a little dicey to move his forward headquarters up here with a NATO unit still present, and that his main headquarters is still well within range of most of his units, but he does consider moving his artillery a little further forward. So he moves his rocket artillery here, and his DAG is still pretty well situated and nicely dug in, so he keeps it where it is. The DAG is fired, so it also needed a fired marker. Okay, so that's the end of his operations segment. To complete his activation cycle, the Warsaw Pact player skips the bridge demolition segment because only NATO gets that segment. He skips the contamination segment because he has not initiated chemical warfare. He skips the intelligence fade segment because he doesn't have any acquisition markers on the map. And he skips the deliberate defense segment because he's not playing in hidden mode. So the only thing that he does is he polices up any of his now irrelevant markers that are on the map, and play proceeds to the NATO player's activation cycle for the 3rd of the 3rd Brigade. The first thing that the NATO player does is his reconnaissance segment. He has got 1 reconnaissance point in his headquarters, and he also has a reconnaissance point in his off-map tracks given to him by the scenario instructions. So he can make a grand total of 2 reconnaissance attempts. For his first reconnaissance attempt, he goes after this BM-21 Grad rocket artillery unit here. He's got a range of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So he refers to the reconnaissance table, and he sees that on the 6 through 10 column against a target in heavy woods, he needs to roll a 9 or a higher. So he rolls the die. He rolls a 4. He has whiffed, so he doesn't see that hex. For his second reconnaissance attempt, he makes an attempt against this tank unit here. The range is 2 to 3. The reconnaissance table tells him that at a range of 2 to 3 in light woods, he needs to roll a 4. He rolls a 6, And so that means he has successfully acquired the hex, and the Warsaw Pact player reveals that there's nothing there but a dummy. So it goes poof, and that's the end of the NATO player's reconnaissance step. He does have 2 units that he can strike here, because they are adjacent to a friendly unit, and he's also got a unit that he can strike here. The NATO player decides that this is the hex that he wants to strike, and so he calls in a helicopter unit, and he also decides that he is going to allocate his rocket artillery unit here. He commits the rocket artillery unit, and then he brings in his helicopter unit. The NATO player maneuvers the unit until it's within 2 hexes of an enemy unit. So he maneuvers it into this hex. The Warsaw Pact player has 6 steps at a range of 2. Each of them has a third of a flak point. So that's a grand total of 2 flak points, which means that the Warsaw Pact player is going to add 2 to his die roll on the anti-aircraft table. The Warsaw Pact player rolls the die. He rolls a 7. He adds 2 to that for a grand total of 9. However, 9 has no effect, so the flak fire misses. The NATO player zooms in a little bit. The NATO player determines that he probably doesn't want to go 1 hex closer, because that would enable the Warsaw Pact player to fire with a grand total of at least 6 flak points. So he stays where he is. He has 8 for his rocket artillery, his MLRS. He has 12 for his Cobras. So 8 and 12 become 20. That 20 is halved to 10. The NATO player rolls the die. He receives an 8. That adds +1 to the number of hits he inflicts, so his 10 becomes 11. The Warsaw Pact player has a defense here against an offensive fire or strike of +2 for being in the light woods. And so his steps each have an adjusted defense strength of 5. So 11 hits are sufficient to claim 2 of his steps and disrupt the rest. The NATO helicopter unit flies off the friendly map edge, and then it is returned to the recovery box of his Trex card. That is the only strike that he declares. He could, in theory, use the 3 air points that he has, but he doesn't see any targets right now that justify doing that, particularly because if he were to make an airstrike at low level, which is his best bet on this hex here, which would be his next choice of target, but he would be going into a world of hurt in terms of the number of flak points that the Soviet player could bring up. So he declines to do that. So play proceeds from the strike segment to the operation segment. For his first operation, the NATO player declares that he is forming a task force with his 4 steps down here. He places a lead unit marker, and he expends a command point from his headquarters to assign it a hasty attack operation, and he names as his target this unit here. Now, he was attacked by 9 steps in this hex, so he knows that this is a dummy, but he's making this his objective so that he can move next to it in order to eliminate the dummy. So the NATO player goes 1, 2, 3. And of course, the Soviet player has to reveal, and so this unit goes poof. The NATO player next makes this objective. He expends his 4th movement point, and so the Warsaw Pact player has to reveal that this unit is also a dummy. And so the NATO player makes this his objective, which was his real objective all along, and so he goes 5 and 6 into this hex. He has no EW asset to jam, On the other hand, the Warsaw Pact player has used all of his artillery. So we proceed straight to defensive fire. The Warsaw Pact unit here has got 4 times 4 or 16 attack points. However, he is disrupted, so that's halved to 8 and then halved down to 4 for the standard division by 2. With only 4 hits, even if he rolls a 10, the most he's going to do is 7 hits of damage. The tank unit has got an adjusted defense strength of 9 plus 1 for being in cover, and therefore there is no possibility that this Warsaw Pact unit can even scratch the tank's paint. So the defensive fire misses. The NATO player now fires. He's got 9 times 4 for 36. After the standard division by 2, that becomes 18. He rolls the die. He gets a 9. That adds 2 to his hit count, so he effectively has inflicted 20 hits on this unit. The adjusted defense strength of this unit is 3 plus 2 for being in light woods, or a total of 5. 20 hits is more than sufficient, well, is actually precisely sufficient to eliminate this unit. So each step dies absorbing 5 hits. There are 20 hits inflicted, so all 4 steps are dead. And that is the end of that regiment. The NATO player chooses to advance in. He has a spare unit counter, so he advances in, and he allocates his steps so that he is going to be harder to see, and the Warsaw Pact player is going to have 2 successful reconnaissance attempts to see all of those steps. The NATO player does a quick survey of the rest of his positions and determines that perhaps his artillery unit is just a little close. So he's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then he will pull back his M109. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He decides to risk leaving his headquarters unit in this town. But he does want to pull out his engineer unit. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then he's got an engineer unit here. And this unit will go 1, 2, 2.5 to here. And that ends his operation segment. He will keep every other unit in place. But he does have the ability to take some of his unused counters and create a few more dummies to confuse the Warsaw Pact player. So he moves one of these here, and he chooses to move one of them 1, 2, 3, 4 to here. Next, he executes the bridge demolition segment, but in this scenario, there's no point to that because neither side can cross a river. And then he ignores the contamination segment because the Warsaw Pact player has not thrown any gas around. He doesn't have any acquisition markers on the map, so he ignores the intelligence fade segment, and he ignores the deliberate defense segment because he is not playing in hidden mode. And that means that he has completed his activation cycle. With the completion of the activation cycle, both players have now completed all of their activations for all of their formations, which means we enter the reorganization phase.